In January 1692, two girls in Salem Village began shaking uncontrollably. They convulsed. They screamed. They claimed something invisible was tormenting them. A doctor examined them, found nothing physically wrong, and offered one diagnosis. He called it the work of the devil. That single word started a machine. Within months, the colony of Massachusetts had arrested over 100 people. 19 would hang. One man was pressed to death under heavy stones. Several others died in jail waiting for a trial that never came. What made this possible was not simply fear or superstition. It was that fear found a legal container, and the container held. Salem Village in 1692 was not a peaceful place before the accusations began. The community had been splitting for years over land, money, and the minister. The Reverend Samuel Parris had enemies. He had also just moved his family into a disputed parsonage. Two of the first accusers were his daughter Betty, 9 years old, and his niece Abigail. The third was Anne Putnam, the daughter of one of Parris's strongest allies. This is not to say the girls were cynically lying from the start. What happened in that first household is genuinely unclear, and probably impossible to reconstruct now. But historians have noted the social geography of who accused whom almost immediately. The accusations mapped almost perfectly onto existing property disputes and factional grudges. That does not explain everything. It explains enough to complicate the simple story. The simple story says mass hysteria. The fuller story says hysteria plus grievance plus opportunity. Before the first arrest warrant was signed, the village needed someone to blame. Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Parris household, was the first person named. She confessed. Records from later accounts suggest she was beaten before doing so. Her confession was also elaborate and useful. She named others. She described a devil's book. She gave the court exactly the kind of testimony it was looking for. That is important, because the court was not a passive receiver of evidence. It was an active participant in shaping what evidence looked like. The magistrates who conducted the early examinations were not trained lawyers in the modern sense. They were local officials operating under a legal tradition that took spectral evidence seriously. Spectral evidence meant that a witness could claim the accused person's spirit had harmed them. It was invisible by definition. It could not be cross-examined. It could not be disproven. This was not a fringe legal idea in 1692. It had theological grounding and judicial precedent. But it created a courtroom where the accused had almost no means of defense. Denial of guilt was almost always interpreted as further evidence of guilt. The logic was circular, and the court did not appear to notice or care. Governor William Phips arrived from England in May 1692 with a new colonial charter. He was walking into a crisis he had not expected and did not fully understand. His response was to create a special court, the court of Oyer and Terminer. The name comes from Old French, meaning roughly to hear and to determine. In practice, it meant a court operating under emergency conditions with wide discretionary power. The first session met in June. By the end of the summer, the executions had begun. Bridget Bishop was hanged on June 10th. She had been accused twice before in earlier years. Her prior reputation made her an easy first target, someone the community already half suspected. She denied everything. The court did not find her denial persuasive. The executions continued through the summer in clusters, not one by one. 5 were hanged in August, 8 more in September. The pace was accelerating. Each hanging did not slow the accusations. It seemed, for a time, to encourage them. Confessing saved your life. Maintaining innocence sent you to the gallows. This created a brutal and simple incentive structure that the court never acknowledged publicly. The people who died were almost entirely those who refused to confess to something they had not done. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old, well-regarded, a full member of the church. Her initial examination returned a verdict of not guilty from the jury. The magistrates sent the jury back to reconsider a single statement she had made. They returned with a guilty verdict. She was hanged on July 19th, along with 4 others. Her family later petitioned for her name to be cleared. That took until 1711. The geography of the accusations is worth slowing down to examine. Most of the accused came from the eastern, more prosperous part of Salem Village. Most of the accusers came from the western, more rural, more economically marginal side. This pattern was noticed by historians in the 20th century, particularly by Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum. Their work in the 1970s mapped the accusations against property records and found striking alignment. That research remains influential and also debated. Geography alone does not produce hangings, but it does suggest that something beyond pure theological panic was operating in the village. Cotton Mather, the prominent Boston minister, followed the trials closely and supported the prosecutions. He attended at least one execution and wrote about it with what can only be described as satisfaction. His published account, Wonders of the Invisible World, defended the court's methods and verdicts. He was not a fringe voice. He was one of the most influential clergymen in Massachusetts. His father, Increase Mather, took a more cautious position on spectral evidence as the summer went on. Increase eventually argued that it was better for 10 suspected witches to escape than for one innocent to die. That principle, which sounds obvious now, was genuinely contested in 1692. As the accusations spread outward, they began to touch people who were harder to dismiss. The wife of the governor was named. A former minister was named. Wealthy merchants were named. At that point, the social composition of the accused population had shifted significantly. When the accusations reached the powerful started paying closer attention. By October 1692, Governor Phipps had received enough pressure and enough doubt to act. He dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer on October 29th, roughly 5 months after it opened. He replaced it with a superior court that explicitly excluded spectral evidence from its proceedings. Of the remaining 52 cases tried under the new court, all ended in acquittals. That number is worth sitting with. 52 people tried, 52 acquittals. The only thing that had changed was the rules about what counted as evidence. The same community, the same accusers in some cases, the same social tensions. Remove spectral evidence, and the legal machine simply stopped producing convictions. This is perhaps the clearest demonstration that the trials were not inevitable, not purely organic panic. They were enabled, specifically and precisely, by a set of legal choices that could have been made differently. Thomas Brittle, a Boston merchant and scientist, had written a letter in October criticizing the court. His letter circulated privately and was direct in its skepticism, unusual for the time. He questioned the reliability of the confessions, noting they were produced under extreme pressure. He questioned the spectral evidence. He questioned whether the afflicted girls were reliable witnesses at all. His letter did not stop the executions. They had already mostly happened by the time it circulated widely. But it is part of the documentary record that shows dissent existed inside the colony even during the trials. The idea that everyone believed and everyone agreed is one of the cleaner myths about Salem. Some people were skeptical from the beginning and said so, at considerable personal risk. Several of the accused who survived had escaped from jail or fled the colony entirely. One, Philip English, a wealthy merchant, fled with his wife to New York and waited it out. His property had been seized while he was imprisoned. He spent years trying to recover it. The financial damage to accused families was substantial, and in many cases never fully repaired. By the winter of 1692, the colony was beginning to reckon with what it had done. Not immediately, not cleanly. The reckoning came slowly and with considerable reluctance. Samuel Sewell was one of the judges who had served on the court of Oyer and Terminer. In 1697, 5 years after the hangings, he stood in his Boston church and read a public apology. He asked the congregation to blame him, not his fellow judges, for the errors of the court. It was an unusual act for the time. No other judge made a comparable public statement. Anne Putnam, one of the most active accusers, eventually issued an apology in 1706. She was 14 years old during the trials. She later said she had acted in ignorance and delusion. Whether that was full accountability or careful self-protection is a question the record cannot fully answer. Samuel Parris, the minister whose household started it, was eventually forced out of Salem Village. He left in 1696 after years of conflict. He never fully acknowledged his role in what had happened. The colony's official day of fasting and reflection in 1697 was a collective gesture, not a judicial review. It acknowledged that errors had been made without specifying exactly who had made them or why. Compensation for the families of the executed began in 1711, nearly 2 decades after the hangings. The amounts were modest. The process was slow. Several families received nothing at all. The last legal act of formal exoneration came in 2001, when the Massachusetts legislature cleared the final names. It had taken 309 years to complete what should have taken a single court session. That gap is not just a legal footnote. It reflects how difficult it is for institutions to admit foundational error. What gets taught about Salem often focuses on the dramatic surface. The girls, the accusations, the hangings. What gets underemphasized is the machinery underneath, the specific legal structures that made it operational. Spectral evidence was not a folk superstition smuggled into a rational courtroom. It was formally admitted by trained magistrates operating under established precedent. The confess and accuse incentive was not an accident. It was the logical outcome of the court's own rules. Once the court decided that confession meant life and denial meant death, the confessions multiplied predictably. The court then used those confessions as evidence of a real conspiracy, which produced more arrests. It was a closed loop. The system fed itself. Fear was the fuel, but law was the engine. This is what makes Salem worth returning to beyond the drama of individual stories. It is a documented case study in how a legal system can become an amplifier of panic rather than a check on it. The safeguards that were missing in 1692, rules of evidence, right to counsel, standards of proof, are not decorative. They exist precisely because Salem and places like it demonstrated what happens when they are absent. One common misconception is that the accused were burned at the stake. They were not. In Salem, the convicted were hanged. One man was pressed with stones. The burning image comes largely from European witch trials and has been incorrectly grafted onto the American story. Another misconception is that Salem was uniquely American or uniquely Puritan in its witch panic. Witch trials occurred across Europe for over 2 centuries, often on a far larger scale. Salem was not the beginning of this history. It was one late chapter of a much longer one. What made Salem distinctive was partly its speed, its concentration into a single summer, and its documentary record. The court records survived. The petitions survived. The letters survived. We can read Thomas Brattle's skepticism. We can read Ann Putnam's apology. We can read the warrants. That paper trail is unusually complete, which is part of why Salem has become such a persistent reference point. The girls who started the accusations in January 1692 were gone from public record within a few years. Betty Paris married and moved away. Abigail Williams disappears from the historical record almost entirely after 1692. What happened to them internally, what they believed or understood or felt, is simply not recoverable. The documents give us the legal record in reasonable detail. They give us the human interior almost not at all. As with most of this history, the surviving accounts reflect what institutions chose to write down. The voices most likely to be distorted or missing are the ones who had the least power to begin with. Tituba, who confessed first and named others and survived, is mostly known through the words of her interrogators. Her own account of what she experienced, if she ever gave one freely, did not survive in any form we can access. Salem did not change everything about how colonial law treated accusations of this kind. But it did mark a turning point in how seriously spectral evidence could be taken in a Massachusetts courtroom. After 1692, no one in the colony was executed for witchcraft again. That is a limited and imperfect improvement. It came after 19 people were already dead. The machine had run its course, produced its damage, and been quietly dismantled. What remained was the record, specific enough to study, incomplete enough to argue about. Details across these events vary depending on which court documents, letters, or later accounts you follow. But the core of what happened is well established. Fear entered a legal structure, and the structure did not hold.